O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about history is actually possible. And the idea of this is that often we talk about studying history to avoid repeating the mistakes of history or to learn what happened in history. And we don't really talk about history, in my opinion, or at least emphasize it, as learning about what creatively is possible or what can occur. And what I mean by that is I've been reading The Nordic Secret with Lene Andersen, and they talk about how you had this school system in the Nordic countries that didn't have a curriculum. It was very much focused on personal development, not necessarily learning, like subjects or something. In that this actually led to incredible development in persons that translated into the remarkable characteristics of the Nordic nations in terms of happiness, wealth, and so on and so forth, or at least that's the case Andersen makes. If you never knew about the Nordic school system, then if someone said to you, hey, let's do a school system that doesn't have a curriculum, you could easily reply, that'll never work, or that is impractical. And impractical is a word I really want to emphasize here because I don't think we realize how often our ideas of what is practical, what is a good use of time, is actually informed by the economy, not by history. But it's interesting because if we were to think about defining what is practical in terms of history, that would give us an entirely different mindset. Because again, since the Nordic school system shows you can have school without a curriculum, then it can be practical to not have a curriculum in school. It might seem impractical and ridiculous not to do it, but we have an example in history where it has been done. Or if the idea that a change in rhetoric can, cause the great enrichment, if that sounds ridiculous or insane, well, if we read McCloskey, then suddenly that's very possible. And the linking of the study of history to the ideas of what is possible and then what is practical versus just having the practical be defined by economics, I think is very, very important. And I think if we just emphasize studying history to avoid the mistakes of history, then we have a very timid way of thinking. I think honestly, reading history to avoid the mistakes of history might be why we don't avoid the mistakes of history, because we don't learn history to expand social imagination or to expand the ideas of what could be based on what has occurred. And I think also something that has always interested me is why is it that some of my favorite philosophers tend to also do a lot of history? Hume, Vico, Hegel. Well, there's something about a historic episode that is something that concretely occurred and yet is a possibility relative to now. Like, if you have this hard question of, well, how do we have a creative possibility that isn't abstract or just based on fantasy or imagination? Well, history can be a source of actual possibility in the sense of it actually occurred. And thus, relative to now, it's not what's happening, but it's something that could happen. And so it can be a basis of imagination that is not merely abstract. And that's very powerful versus if you don't have history as the basis of creative possibility, then your creativity is going to be probably erring on imagination and just whatever hypotheticals you can come up with or thought experiments, right? Like it almost seems in philosophy, as an example, you either have to use history as the basis of your arguments or thoughts, or you end up in logic or, thought experiment. And logic and thought experiment are not inherently bad, but the problem is both of those are quite susceptible to just fall into internal consistency and coherence that we warn about in O.G. Rose, which is where thought finds its own symmetry and its own justification, and that can be a source of power and totalitarianism and stuff like that. Also, studying history is an encounter by definition of otherness, right? Because you don't decide what happened in history, and so it is otherness. The material is not of your making. And that right there kind of forces you to think beyond yourself. I think, if there's something about empathy and critical thinking that are deeply connected, as we've argued in O.G. Rose, then if history gets you outside of yourself, encountering other people, seeing how the other people thought, that right there can be an encounter with otherness that can be creatively fruitful. And I think a lot of creativity comes from encounters with otherness. And so history can be that source. But again, critically, history is a concrete possibility. Relative to now, history is not occurring. But since it did occur, it becomes the basis of thinking how we could change things now that is not just in just the imagination. Now, of course, our interpretation of history could be wrong. We still have to work through that, and that makes me think of Hayden White, and there is definitely something to be said about learning how to interpret well. So there's, I would argue, if history is going to be the basis of thought as creative possibility, we must learn literature, we must learn how to read literature and literary texts, which again is a Hayden White or a Selby Foote kind of point. But you still have problems of interpretation even with imagination, because if you imagine an idea, you have to interpret what that means and how you bring it into the world. So the interpretation problem doesn't go away, but at least in the historic episode it can be anchored, primarily also because other people can easily study the history itself, right? Like if you're studying the American Civil War, there are other people studying the American Civil War who can check and balance you, who can question you. And so other scholars, other people they can provide a basis for helping you to get outside of yourself, where if you're simply interpreting or thinking through your own thought experiment, other people can't observe it like you. So I think it becomes a lot easier to get stuck in your own enclosure, right? So there's something more communal about history. And if history becomes a basis of creative possibility, then it becomes that creativity is also more likely or more possibly communal, which I think is very important, because creativity that is more individual is more likely to end up in egotism and trouble like that. So history becomes a way to say, well, this occurred. If that did occur, we could try it now. And of course, every repetition has an excess of creativity, thinking Hume and Deleuze and all of that. So you can't literally repeat history, but you can, but you can have similar forms in repetition. And this being said, you could almost say history repeats because we don't try to repeat it, right? And that's also because in not trying to repeat history, we don't actually, that means we're not creating out of history. Our creative attempts are just based on fancy, you could almost say. So there's a funny way too, which we might say history repeats because we don't try to repeat history, which would be a creative act. Every repetition must have an excess. You can't literally repeat something. And I think with that as well, what's critical to note is if you are under a system, let's say the capital nation state of Koratani, or you're captured by societies of control in a Deleuzian sense, well then I would argue, because I think it's rationality itself, autonomous rationality, that leads to these problems, because they tend to be game theory problems. Well, the only way you get out of that is a new social imagination, to use that Mills term, or a new non-rationality. Well, that would mean you have to create something new. You have to think something new, or you're going to be stuck in the horizon, the horizon you're in the logic of the horizon you're in, and so you're going to be stuck in oppression, right? So if there are various, if the meta crisis is real, or the meaning crisis, or different things, that right there requires an imaginative change. And we could also think of like Charles Taylor with imagination, right? Okay, so if there's crisis, and we require imagination, then we have to imagine new alternatives. The question is simply what's going to be the basis of those new alternatives. The argument we are making is that history should be the basis of those alternatives, which then would suggest any effort to make a new society that starts by erasing history is notably suicidal. Like if you say, well, we're going to create a blank slate by which to make a new society, this is incredibly foolish, because history is the basis by which you know what possibilities are possible, what possibilities are actually possible. And so if you erase history, you have nothing to create with. You have no material. But a blank slate is one thing, but a blank, absolute nothingness is another, right? And when you erase history, you're not making a blank slate. You're making an empty void that's going to suck you in. And so trying to create a new society by first erasing history is very foolish, because history is concrete possibility. And so, I think also what we should note here is I think one of the problems of what happens, though, is often when we study history, we often study big history, like the history of Europe or the history of America or something. And often, at that large of a scale, most imaginative projects do fail, actually. Like, I think of Leopard's Co., Breakdown of Nations. Like, the larger the scale, the more likely new attempts, new possibilities fail. And the more often you also end up in, you try something and it doesn't go work, or there's like corruption. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of, backstabbing or war. So when you study big history, I think you're going to see a lot of failures of trying something or something not going well, simply because of the scale of the things in the history classroom you are studying, right? Well, this is a problem, because then the idea, studying history will overly orient you toward being conservative. Now, this is not to say conservative is bad, but you basically then, from reading big history, are going to always, your disposition to kind of believe that trying something new always leads to a French Revolution or something like that. But if you instead study small things, I almost want to say, like the Nordic school system, or, the Silk Roads, or modes of exchange in Koratani, or stuff like that, you actually see many successes, many creative successes, but they're on a small scale, and they tend to be narrow and specific. But we unfortunately don't tend to study that kind of history. We study a large history that tends to suggest in that very study that creative attempts fail, and they shouldn't be done. Now, again, and belonging again too, we talk about the four arrows, and once we start talking about new social possibility, we are talking about something very, very dangerous. But again, if you're in a moment of history of, say, a meta-crisis, where you must think new social possibilities, then that risk must be taken. But the best material for those new possibilities are history, and if we only study history at a big scale, we're really not going to find creative possibilities. We're just going to get a lot of narratives of failure and devastation, and that's not the material from which we can best consider new social possibilities. It's going to tend to be smaller scale or more specific or focused things, right? This would suggest, as a useful note, that we should study history from the things we're working on. Like, if we're passionate about the school system, we should study the history of the school system, or the science classroom in particular. If we're interested in making a new alternative energy, then maybe reading Vaclav-Smil in the history of energy would be a useful thing. Like, I think one of the reasons we may not really understand how much can be provided by history is because we tend to encounter history from a history classroom in a high school or college, especially a high school, that is general and large, and we don't encounter reading history from the position of a project that really provides a lot of inspiration and ideas, right? We don't. Well, one, I mean, this is probably, if school trains us out of intrinsic motivation, we don't even have projects from which to read history from. So it's like a double whammy. School leads you toward extrinsic motivation, where you only learn when the teacher tells you to, and the teacher only tells you to learn big history, which tends to be a story where good ideas just lead to horrible unintended consequences. And so you say, well, history teaches that we shouldn't try to do anything different, which benefits the capital nation state and benefits power, right? So you need intrinsic motivation, and from that intrinsic motivation, study history, both, which is what school on both counts trains you out of. You're trained to read history on a large scale, and you're trained out of intrinsic motivation. So we really don't encounter history as a potential source of concrete possibilities, and thus we just read history to know what happened or to avoid the mistakes of history, which is not going to be what we need for social imagination. We don't often associate creators with historians, but I think we need to start making this connection. I think if so much now rides upon changing conditions of possibility, which is, theory underground, philosophy portal emphasize, and history are conditions of possibility that actually occurred, that we can employ to some degree, some relative degree, that's quite important. And I think, history is power, we're told, but I don't think it's mainly the power to avoid error, which for Hegel is a fear of history. I would say history is the power of knowing what is possible. And I think, if we think of history as this basis of creation, That one will inspire people to read history. Two, our efforts to generate new social structures will be better informed, will be better engineers. I mean, you can almost say that history is what teaches you to be a social engineer, whereas we have so many social engineers that are just politicians based on technical knowledge, which turns us all into robots and leads to all the freaking trouble of the, that Thomas Sowell might talk about and stuff like that. Well, we need to talk about social engineers of the middle, the communal, the commons, not social engineers of like the state, but these are distinctions that have to be brought out in Belonging Again too. Juvenal, Michelle Bowens, etc., so forth. And the emphasis here is moving history to not being seen as simply a study of error, but a study of possibility. And I do think that history repeats because we don't learn history to create. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, YouTube, Amazon. You can find our books. All purchases and reviews are very much appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.